Okay, so you want to get to the bottom of things right. We've all got busy lives, so we don't have time to waste. That's why we do these deep dives. Today, we're going deep on an audio recording of a comedy radio show called Past Week Next Week with Chris and Paul. This one's from March 30th, 2025. And what do you you might be surprised how much interesting stuff we're going to unpack from it.
Absolutely. I mean, on the surface, it's a comedy show, so we can expect some laughs. But what's cool is they work in all these news stories and, personal anecdotes and even cultural observations that I think can give us some real insights. It's our job to kind of separate those nuggets from all the jokes they tell just for the sake of telling jokes.
Yeah, like think of us as your shortcut. We're doing all the heavy lifting, so you can just sit back and become an expert on all this material without having to listen to the whole thing. Plus, these guys are super casual. It's like you're just hanging out, listening to a couple of guys shoot the breeze, but they're actually really informed, and you're going to learn a lot. Okay, so they start off with a little Barbra Streisand. Send in the clowns.
And right away you can see they're doing something interesting with this. So Paul, he thinks it's a reference to their trip to Vegas. Like Missouri was sending in the clowns, He got a little bit of credit for that, but there's actually a deeper meaning tied to a news story they jump into next.
And that was this whole Signalgate thing. And their reactions were pretty strong. They were calling people morons, irresponsible, like beyond parody, even beyond the pale. It definitely seemed like they were worked up about this.
Yeah, it was more than just a casual comment, right? They were genuinely frustrated and worried about the whole situation, especially the lack of consequences. I think that's interesting because even though this is a comedy show, it shows us how people were feeling about this issue at the time.
Right, and to drive that point home, they even brought up a joke Bill Maher made. Something about how third-rate celebrities are more upset about how they were treated on The Apprentice than about Signalgate. It's like this weird sense of, misplaced priorities.
Yeah. It really does make you think about what we choose to focus on, right?
Yeah.
Like, are we getting distracted by silly stuff when there are really important things going on? I also picked up on this feeling of, weary resignation. Almost like they're worried about what these kinds of events could lead to in the future.
Okay, so enough about serious stuff for a second. Let's talk about the funny personal stories they shared. Like, Paul couldn't resist giving Chris a little grief about his age. This was before Chris launched into a story about his first time skiing in 10 years.
Oh, yeah, that whole skiing story.
Yeah.
So relatable. Like that internal battle between wanting to have fun and then that little voice in your head, the voice of reason, I guess, or maybe just fear of getting hurt. And then he had this pretty big wreck on a blue run, too.
But his reaction was so funny. He's just like, yeah, I wiped out, slid head first. It was nothing. You just got to lift your legs and spin around. He made it sound so easy, even though it was clearly a bit of a disaster.
I think it shows, experience. He'd been there before, even if it was a long time ago. And then they talk about how Jane was a first-timer and stayed on the bunny hill. Pretty classic dynamic, right? Anyone who's tried to get someone else to their hobby has been there.
Totally. And then they get into the steamboats hot springs, those natural ones,
Yeah.
That whole idea of going from super hot water to the freezing river sounds crazy.
It's that contrast, right? Hot to cold. It's one of those things that makes the experience so memorable.
For sure. So Paul had his own little adventure in New York for work, caught a showing of Singfeld, I think he meant Seinfeld there, and got some New York pizza. I mean, you can't really go to New York without getting pizza.
Right. It's like a requirement. But I think their big shared adventure was their trip to Vegas for the bar and restaurant expo.
Yeah, this wasn't your typical trade show, It sounded more like a party. Tequila shots, palomas, whiskey, beer, all the freebies were liquid. Kind of tells you a lot about that industry, huh?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely a different kind of work event, right?
Wow.
The emphasis is on experiencing the products. They specifically mentioned Suncoast iced tea. They had a big setup. And then Renoco. There's some tasty samples.
But here's a funny thing. One of the best parts of their whole Vegas trip was the bread at the expo. I mean, after all those drinks, who wouldn't love some good bread, right?
Right. Sometimes it's the little things. And then they rave about this breakfast they had at the Ellis Island Casino. A $14.99 New York strip special. You get an 8-ounce steak, 3 eggs, breakfast potatoes, toast sourdough, of course, and coffee with Baileys or a Bloody Mary.
Sounds amazing. And then they had dinner at Tony Roma's, another great deal. A $12.99 lobster tail and steak special. I mean, they really found the value spots. Who knew you could eat so well in Vegas for so cheap?
We got to know where to look, right? It's not all high rollers and expensive buffets. And, of course, we can't forget the gambling. Paul put a bet on the Chiefs for the next Super Bowl. He was feeling good about it, too.
That's the Vegas spirit. Chris had more of a system, though. He was talking about how he plays video poker just to get a free drink. You put in $20, play a little bit cash out once the cocktail arrives.
Smart. Minimal risk, maximum reward. Paul then shared a classic Vegas story about losing his credit card. He was freaking out, but then it turned up, thanks to a helpful bartender. I bet that's a pretty common experience in Vegas, huh?
Yeah, probably. And then we get this sweet little shout out to Molly. Her photo from a Suki Waterhouse concert ended up in Vogue. Pretty cool.
Yeah, that is cool. Although their reactions to who Suki Waterhouse is and who Garrett Hedlund is were pretty funny. Like a reminder that we all have gaps in our pop culture knowledge.
Totally. But then it was back to reality for Chris. The Vegas trip is over, and it was back to work and a board meeting.
So they had this regular segment called The Texture. This week, The Texture was in a void, but still managed to send in a bunch of listener questions. It's kind of like their version of listener mail.
Right. And we get some real gems. Like one person asked about their favorite viaduct, the off-street one apparently, then 12th Street. Then there's this deep question about whether it bothers them that some people don't like running. They even told a story about a childhood race and some injustice they felt.
And then there's this one listener who connects Barbra Streisand to Def Leppard's Pour Some Sugar on Me. Now that's a leap in logic.
I know, right? Totally out of left field. They talked a bit about the ending of Severance too. Agreed it was a good cliffhanger. And there was a funny bit about not being invited to Vegas.
Right, and then we get this random story about a skiing prison joke.
Yeah.
And a question about whether Chris will ever ski again, considering his bionic hip. Probably not the best idea. And then things got a little weird with the question about the Steamboat Hot Springs as a potential swinger spot.
Whoa. They handled that one pretty well, though. Acknowledged the whole bathing suits optional after dark thing, but also pointed out the realities of being naked in a natural hot spring. The too many bee-holes comment was interesting.
It was. And then the texture got philosophical about the freedom of choosing your eggs, your toast, your salad dressing size, those little things we take for granted. And then there was a very vague question about putting a 20 in a hot dancer's G-string. Not sure what that was about.
Yeah, who knows? And then they mentioned this invitation they got from hustlers to visit their booth at the expo. Definitely not your average trade show experience. And then the texture chimes in with, I date Garrett too. Random.
In the midst of all the silliness, they did address a serious question about a lawsuit against father. A place for mom for discriminating against fathers.
Yeah.
Good on them for acknowledging that. It shows that even on a comedy show, there's space for important conversations.
Absolutely. Okay, so then they switched gears and started talking about what Paul had been up to. A lot of it was family stuff. There was an engagement party for Audrey and Chloe. He talked about the brunch and, finding the right person. Then there's this ongoing saga of their friend Holly wanting to come on the show to talk about the Kennedy conspiracy. Paul was not into that idea.
Which is understandable. He even called the show Four Wise Ass, talking about stuff, which is pretty accurate. He also talked about being sick for 2 weeks after his flu shot, and then going to Vegas right after. He also gave a shout out to Phil Laboda, LLC, talked about his Chiefs bat and the never-ending chore of cleaning the garage.
They got into birthdays, too. Chris had a low-key celebration, work then Longhorn Steakhouse before heading to Colorado. Paul's brunch at a WA was a bit of a letdown, but he did get a shirt and they went to their neighbor's engagement party.
And there was this sweet story about how Paul knew Audrey and Chloe would get married years ago. And then they talked about birthdays at their age. Less about the parties, more about just another year gone by. I feel that.
Then they got to their promises made, promises kept segment. Usually it's about Trump, but this time it was about this journalist Bart Gellman, who was accidentally added to a group chat with some top Trump officials. And they were discussing military plans on Signal.
They were pretty shocked by that.
Yeah.
Even played the Three Stooges theme song. They compared the whole thing to something out of a slapstick comedy.
Yeah.
And then there was that joke about the VP telling Greenland they weren't getting good government. Ouch.
They played a clip of J.D. Vance and his wife talking to soldiers, too. It was super awkward. And they mentioned how Trump wasn't responsible for this one deportation because, quote-unquote, Lil Mario wanted it.
Yeah, that was weird. And there was this definite sense of uneasiness about the whole thing. Like, Paul even said he stopped following pro-Trump people on Facebook. It's interesting they haven't had any face-to-face arguments about any of this stuff, at least not that they mentioned.
Okay, news quiz time. They had a little trouble finding it first. Kind of funny.
So the first question. They clarified it was Jeffrey Goldberg from The Atlantic, not Bart or Burke. He got added to that Signal group chat with J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth. And they were discussing attack plans. The answer, of course, was Signal. And they were concerned about using an app with disappearing messages for this kind of sensitive stuff, like potentially keeping information from the public or even from Trump himself.
Question 2. The Prime Minister called for a snap election on April 28th. That was Canada. And they went on a bit of a rant about how they wish the U.S. had a similar system. Criticized the Senate and the executive branch, even brought up slavery in the context of how the Senate was created. Strong opinions there.
Yeah, they didn't hold back. Question 3. Democrat Dan Gofauer Hanley won a special election in Pennsylvania. They talk about how this could affect the midterms and the difference between special and general elections.
Question 4. A Trump donor tried to get the Supreme Court to overturn a 1964 defamation ruling and failed. That was Steve Wynn. Chris joked about how he wasn't that upset about missing out on a trip to the Wynn.
Last question. The Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation is reclaiming land in Illinois. It's a sad story about how the chief's land was illegally auctioned off by the government while he was away in Kansas. It's another example of how poorly indigenous people have been treated. They did pretty well overall in the quiz. 4 out of 5, right?
And then the texter popped back in with the more random stuff. He said the biggest airplane ever funded by Howard Hughes was the Spruce Goose, and then very bluntly stated that Elon Musk is a joke. Hard to disagree with that these days.
He also mentioned Tim Walz's town hall meetings and how much excitement they generated. Compare that to the lack of excitement on Lane Street, and pointed out the irony of Elon Musk crying about Tesla's stock dropping while also laying people off.
The texter pointed out that XAI is buying X, more Elon Musk stuff, and asked if they take his AI stuff seriously. Then there was this random memory about Velvet sticking up for Leon at Boogie's wedding. That came out of nowhere.
Finally, the texters shared their favorite movies from the past 6 months. Grease, Wicked, and the Saturday Night Live movie. A real mix.
Okay, so the pop culture update. The Othello revival with Denzel Washington and Jake Gyllenhaal is breaking Broadway box office records. They both want to see it. Talked about how black actors haven't had many chances to play Othello in the past, and wondered how much tickets cost.
Selena Gomez said women have it much harder on social media than men. The hosts agreed, shared some stories about nasty comments and how the people who write them don't always look so great themselves. A little hypocrisy there.
E.J. Novak made a joke about Mindy Kaling loving fame at her Hollywood Walk of Fame ceremony. This led to some speculation about her kids and who the father might be. B.J. Novak's name was mentioned. They also said she's stunning in person and gave her show Never Have I Ever a shout-out.
For Ted Lasso fans, there's a rumor that it might be back for a 4th season on Apple TV+. Chris hasn't even seen season 3 yet. The texter chimed in with a fun fact about Zagreb, Croatia having these scaled models of the sun and planets all over the city. Chris thought that was cool. The texter also claimed that Ted Lasso is going to film in Kansas City.
The Boogie update was classic Boogie. He sent a text saying he was okay, but missed the show for, quote-unquote, probably the worst reason in the history of missing the podcast. Work. They were skeptical. He said he tried to listen but couldn't focus. Called Barbara Streisand hot, along with Condoleezza Rice and Stephanie Ruhle. Apparently shares a birthday with Paul's dad and has the same taste in women. And the kicker, he's running an Ironman next week.
Then they realized they forgot to start the YouTube live stream. Whoops. They apologized, but also said that people probably didn't miss that much. One listener pointed out that the new show title makes it sound like Chris is still talking about his ski trip. A little meta humor there.
Okay, headlines and predictions. The White House pulled Elise Stefanik's nomination for UN ambassador, apparently to protect the Republican majority in the House. They even joked about George Santos making a comeback. They also discussed Stefanik's change in political views and how she might lose her seat.
The Senate Armed Services leaders want the Pentagon to investigate that Signal group chat, and a judge ordered them to preserve the messages. Republicans tried to downplay it, but the hosts weren't buying it.
Trump signed an executive order going after the Smithsonian for promoting divisive narratives. He wants J.D. Vance to purge it of improper ideology and put back all the monuments that were changed after 2020. You know, the Confederate ones. Vance also had some thoughts on how men and women should act.
Another executive order ended collective bargaining for federal employees and national security rules. The American Federation of Government Employees was not happy about it. The host made a cynical joke about airport security lines.
DoorDash has a new Eat Now, Pay Later option. Someone quoted Wimpy saying, "I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today." Kraft Heinz is getting into hard seltzer with a Crystal Light version. They also mentioned a squirt hard seltzer and made up a ridiculous slogan about castor oil. Then there was a joke about Gerber baby food hard seltzer.
The texter offered up a final few thoughts. Did you know that no number before 10,000 has the letter A in it? Then he asked why the Pope can't be an organ donor. They didn't know the answer. He also said Chris's Aunt Patty was a good one.
And in the next week, Chris will be attending his Aunt Patty's celebration of life. He and Molly are having dinner on Thursday, and he probably won't be on the next show because he's taking his mother-in-law to a matinee of Back to the Future. Paul has a lunch meeting. They talk briefly about the trend of turning Broadway shows into movies and vice versa. Chris is tired of all the remakes. They mention the musical Anything Goes and the old TV show Almost Anything Goes. Paul's favorite is probably Mean Girls. The band Wet Leg is releasing a new song on Tuesday, but they won't be able to play it next week. Sherry Whiting and Aunt Glenda will also be at Aunt Patty's celebration of life, and they apologize to a listener named Amy for letting her down. Again.
So as you can see, even a goofy comedy show can cover a ton of ground. We got political blunders, Vegas shenanigans, Broadway news listener trivia. It's all in there.
We got a glimpse into the Signal Gate mess, learned about the wild world of bar and restaurant expos, and heard some opinions on the state of American politics. Plus, the texture kept things interesting with their unique brand of randomness.
If anything we talked about today sparked your interest, I encourage you to do a little digging on your own. Maybe check out that solar system model in Zagreb or the lawsuit against A Place for Mom, or give that new Wet Leg song a listen.
And here's a thought. How much can we actually learn about the world and ourselves from entertainment? Like, can a comedy show with all its jokes and stories actually give us insights into what's going on around us?